In case you were ever wondering, my favourite time of day is when it's 4 AM and you look out the window and you realise you've spent the whole night doing nothing and it's suddenly the breaking of a new day. Again. So it goes without saying that Trails Through Daybreak will be an all-timer for me. Back when the game originally came out in 2021, I couldn't wait for it. As soon as they launched the demo for it, I was there. Day 1, frame 1, hour 0, however other variants of things you can say, words. Let me tell you, those 20 minutes I put into that demo when I tested out the combat, whew, they were a dream. Those 20 minutes, that small period of time, altered what I thought combat could be, transitioning from action to turn-based without even so much as a loading screen. It was mind-blowing, absolutely mind-blowing to me. Ever since that day, I have dreamed of playing Trails Through Daybreak, so much so that in my Trails into Reverie video from last year that was 3 months late, we won't talk about it, I made sure to highlight one of my favourite parts of that game, which was just the parts connected to Daybreak at the end of the game after you beat the entirety of Reverie that just had little stories about Daybreak characters. I've even started to learn Japanese since playing that demo, partly just because I wanted to play Falcom games early, even if that didn't pan out and I can still only speak very, very basic Japanese. So, after playing Trails Through Daybreak, was it worth the hype? Well, that question is really stupid because most Falcom games are, and Daybreak most certainly is. It's the first game in Falcom's brand new engine and it really does feel like the next generation of Trails. I'm not just talking about the combat either, but the visuals themselves have seen a pretty big upgrade, or to be more accurate, a pretty big modelling and lighting change, actually. If you remember back in the day, from Cold Steel 2 to Cold Steel 3 had a really big change in rendering style thanks to Trails now just being a PS4 game and not a PS Vita game, but the jump from Reverie, which uses Cold Steel 3 and 4 style, to Daybreak, which is the new style, is a little bit more nuanced than that jump. The new shading and lighting technique used for the new models, and especially the main characters in particular, is gorgeous, with some of the models just being straight up drop-dead gorgeous, and the environments feel like they have more to them in certain areas thanks to the new ability to be able to change height in terrain organically through gameplay. That is a lot of words to just say you can now walk up slight hills. The first area that comes to mind for this is the area just outside of Cray, where you go to fetch a bike that's been stolen in Chapter 1. This area consists of small hills and different levels of ground to walk on that can be walked up and down freely with a lot of dense fauna lining each side of the road. This is pretty commonplace in a lot of games, but Trails hasn't really had this as far as I can remember, so it took me by a massive welcome surprise to see it here. All that aside, the new engine does have some quirks, namely some lighting indoors. It's a bit wonky here and there. I'm looking at you, Basel Institute of Science and Vegas Films, but generally it feels like another upgrade visually from the past games, which is saying something, considering I think Cold Steel 3 through to Reverie are some of the nicest looking games around, honestly. The action gameplay is really tight, and there's actually a shocking amount of depth for something that is only really there as a vehicle to get you into turn-based combat. You have charge attacks to deal more stun / break / stagger bar damage, and then you also have perfect dodges that refill that bar immediately without needing to hit the enemy to fill it. There's also enemies that are strong or weak against either magic or physical attacks, which incentivizes you to switch between your characters and have a varied party capable of using magic and physical attacks. It keeps in tradition with the series doing this for its turn-based battles, which Daybreak also continues, while adding a bit of texture to your action combat too. It's really nice. Moving over to the combat turn-based system now, and the changes to it really feel like a natural evolution for the series. Making movement a key factor instead of something used to basically just get out of the way of spells is pretty inspired, and the addition of area-specific attacks, side, back attacks, makes so much sense for this battle system. Movement and planning where attacks will land has always been something pretty unique about the Trails series, and implementing it in combat as a more ingrained mechanic at the 10-ish games, and after making it so that you can move at any point during combat instead of it taking a turn, it just makes sense. and I'm really happy it finally happened. Xenoblade's side-specific attacks are really fun, and I don't know if that's the direct inspiration here, but they replicate that fun wholeheartedly, combining that fun, actually, with what I like to call the most satisfying mechanic in gaming, which is the lining up of crafts to hit every enemy you want to attack, makes for some exquisite turn-based gameplay. It's just so fun. Oh yeah, look at that, I mean come on! The addition of S-Boosts is cool too, and tying S-Brakes to them makes the change to having S-Brakes cap at 100 instead of 200 makes sense too, as every S-Brake will be more powerful on the whole thanks to the S-Boosts, and giving you 2 to use if you're maxed out can lead to some absolutely insane craft builds for characters. By the end of the game, Ven would be hitting 3 to 4 S-Brakes in a row with maybe a turn where he takes damage between them, and while this is super satisfying and made bosses kneel before me, it did turn a lot of the fights in the game into a cakewalk from when I made the build until the end game. But I also could have turned the difficulty up, so that's not on the game, frankly. It was so fun I didn't want to crank it up, if I'm being completely honest. There aren't many downsides to the new mechanics in the game's combat, and the main element I actually do have an issue with, which is the new turn order, is entirely fixed in Daybreak 2 thanks to them making it linear again instead of it just being up for interpretation, I guess. I mean, if that next counter wasn't there, I'd have absolutely no idea who's next. Literally zero. But if we're being honest, if I'm nitpicking about something like that, which again doesn't actually matter that much because the next counter is mostly there except when it's not and it's actually up for interpretation, you know they've actually done a pretty good job adapting this to a new look and feel, honestly. The only other downside is that they've nerfed specific builds, but to talk about that, we have to talk about the new Orbment System. When it comes to the Orbment System, the only constant with it is that it changes a lot. And since Reverie and Trails Through Daybreak are in different arcs, there's been a pretty decent overhaul to the entire system. The new Orbment System is a fun combination of the various Orbments from before Daybreak with some added twists to make them unique all in their own right. How the system works is that you have 4 separate lines of quartz amounted to either 15 or 16 quartz in total. This is a step up from Reverie and the games prior, which had less quartz you could fit into one build. Each line dictates a certain element of turn-based gameplay and gives you skills for that element of the gameplay known as shard skills, or as I like to call them, shard skills. That was a bad joke, I'm sorry. I will move on. The attack line has quartz and shard skills related to... I can't take it seriously since I've said shard skill. Anyway, the attack line has quartz and shard skills related... Okay, serious face. The attack line has quartz and skills related to physical attacks, such as giving you a certain elemental damage bonus to certain attacks, or letting you finish off an enemy on low health. The shield line houses the defensive side of the game, so these skills will grant you resistances to certain ailments and even allow you to revive when you get killed once per battle. Drive is the line that dictates the art you use in combat. It's much the same as the attack line, but this time for arts, giving you elemental damage bonuses and offensive art skills like Arc Feather, which allows you to sometimes follow up an offensive art with another attack, which can stack with the elemental damage to get some very high numbers. Let me tell you, oh brother, and yes, was doing some damage by the end game. Oh boy. And finally, you have the extra line, which doesn't dictate any specific part of gameplay, but what it does is add special skills to your combat, like auto buff, starting fight with buff/positive ailments, and stuff like that. I like to call it the fun line, where we do fun things and fun stuff. To bring it back around though to how it's similar to the old systems and mixes them together to create something new, you actually have the line system from Sky returning with the twist of the quartz affecting skills on your line instead of the spells you get. You then have the hollow cores and art drivers acting as the 2 halves of a master quartz from Crossbound and the expansion of that in Cold Steel. And the quartz themselves are essentially the ones from Cold Steel 3 onwards. The shard skills themselves are a really cool idea and a way of bringing some of the more situational Master Quartz abilities from Cold Steel into Daybreak. An example of this is the Revival one, which is a Master Quartz ability in Cold Steel 3 onwards that was incredible for a party member like Elisa, who would be a healer, so you could have an entire party wipe, she would revive, and then you would just do a party-wide heal. Brilliant. They even bring back the Link skill from Cold Steel, where you can finish off an enemy that's at low health, as mentioned earlier. There's genuinely some really fun new ones here too, like Arc Feather, which we've spoken about. The auto buffs are incredible, as is the ability that siphons health and combat points off the enemy when you attack. There's a lot here to love. It's very freeing as a system, but there are a few teething problems with the new Orbment system. Firstly, there aren't enough high-level shard skills to take advantage of. The few I listed here are actually most of the ones that will matter come the endgame, and while that's fine and dandy, there's a few of them, to say the least, if we include buffs and positive ailments. But due to the combat having removed a couple of things that wouldn't make sense for this arc, it can lead to there being fewer character builds, and certain builds having less importance compared to Cold Steel and Reverie in particular. The example I want to use is the evasion tank. Now, Daybreak has kept the evasion counter damage buff from the goated Master Quartz from Cold Steel 3 onwards that made Kurd, Fee and Swin into gods amongst braces, but this time it uses a holocore buff that you're granted for S boosting. This means it isn't a constant thing, as S boosts only last for 3 turns, so that's a nerf to the evasion tanks already. The reason they were so good in Cold Steel is because you could get upwards of 200% damage on counters, whereas you're looking at 40 to 60% in Daybreak, which is another nerf. Daybreak has not only done that to nerf the admittedly broken evasion tanks though, they've changed it so that counters aren't guaranteed for every miss anymore, or at least as far as I can tell anyway. This leads to the evasion tank still being really fun because party members will just not get hit, which is always fun, but it does mean their damage output is a lot less, especially if you forget to S-boost, and they don't have as good of a reason to stay on the team as they used to. Also, there aren't sub-holo cores, like Master Quartz, meaning you can only have one character use the holo core with the evasion damage buff, which means you can only have as many types of a character build that you have holo cores that increase those parameters, if that makes sense. I tend to build my RPG parties out of characters I like more than how good they are in gameplay, but in Cold Steel and Reverie I always made sure to have one evasion tank on every team just because they were so fun. So Fee, Swin and Kurd were mainstays for me, and I even tried making Yuna and Lloyd into evasion tanks just because they were so fun. That's also not to say though that the system doesn't actually birth new types of character builds as well as adding new wrinkles to staple builds from previous games. For example, the chain of attacks you land before an enemy moves ups damage in Daybreak, and you can now make a character whose sole purpose is to manipulate turn order, increase that number, and therefore increase your output on your other characters. The art plugins and drivers help art become an incredibly versatile option thanks to untying the art from the Master Quartz, whereas before you had the Master Quartz defining the art you could use outside a specific quartz that granted spells, which let Falcon keep the reins on making broken character combinations this way. They've done away with that so that you can have art drivers that can be coupled with any holo core, and art plugins which allow you to add to the pool of art available via the art driver with whichever art you desire, as long as it has a plugin available. Which is a long sentence and a lot of words and terms that sound similar, but basically drivers have set arts and then plugins can add various other arts to those if there's plugins available for them. I hope that makes sense. So this means you can now run healing spells on physical damage dealers without sacrificing quartz slots to make sure that if the healer dies, you can revive them. You can run an art driver that has a few elements of magic and make up the elements you don't have through plugins on your offensive caster, and combining this with the Arc Feather ability from earlier is really fun, so I ended up having 2 offensive casters on my team in Daybreak instead of the usual one I have. There's also some absolutely broken builds from previous games that somehow feel even more broken in Daybreak. My favourite example of this is how I made Van into the combat point generator, whereby the end game he had a quartz that increased the amount of points gained by taking damage by 5, an accessory that gave him 15% bonus to the amount gained, and another which gave him 15 per turn. His S boost would then also give him 6 per turn, and combining all of this with the shard skills to start fights buff, auto buff at start of turns and gain health and combat points back when you attack, Van would sometimes S break 4 times in a row and fully heal himself from low health just from the siphoning health. This was incredibly funny because boss fights would just end before they had a turn sometimes, and would also bite me in the ass when I did so much damage the boss could just S-break against me on their turn. It was a balance, but boy, was it fun. Basically, what I want this section to say is that Falcom had to rebuild this combat in the new engine and added an entirely new element to it with the action combat, while also revamping the Orbment system, And considering this is the first game in that new engine, how it fully brings over the Trails combat while also adding to it with action combat and new turn-based systems is commendable, but downright masterful at the same time. Anyway, enough about combat. We don't need to talk about mechanics any longer. Not yet, anyway. So, how about some vibes? Trails has always had immaculate vibes, and Daybreak is no different. The vibes mostly stem from the gameplay loop between the combat sections, which can often be about 3 hours long, the world building, and the NPCs you meet along the way. Oh, and the music, which you've been hearing this entire video and is made by Falcom, so why are we even asking the question? Of course it's fantastic. I'd often find myself just walking around town and standing there listening to the music, ambient sound, and just taking it. Oh my god, did I just walk into a building without a loading screen? That might not sound revolutionary, but taken from someone who also thought this was revolutionary in Yakuza, this is some of the most game-changing stuff in the medium. Oh man, it's so cool. It takes about like 10 hours to adjust to because you've played 10 games where you're just doing loading screens every 30 seconds. This is insane. This is so cool. Oh yeah, I also mentioned ambient voiceover. Daybreak features ambient voiceover now, which is a feature I absolutely love because it makes the world feel more alive. I recognized it in Persona 3 Reload and it helped me really feel more immersed there, and the same is true for Daybreak. Daybreak doesn't do much to change the formula from previous games in regards to the overall gameplay loop, but it doesn't need to, as Trails probably has the most rock-solid gameplay loop that's been refined over many games. You start a chapter doing quests around Edith, and then after an in-game day of doing quests there, you're sent on an assignment to a specific place and do a few days of quests there before the big main story event happens, and then you come back to Edith to do it all over again. It's a really cozy vibe, and one of the best in the industry at making you immersed in the world due to how Falcom builds its world through these visits to places around whichever country you're in, and the side quests too, which are a particular highlight in Daybreak. I felt invested in a lot of the narratives that took place within the side quests in Daybreak, and saw myself remembering characters from those quests to say hello to when I was walking around the world, like Jess, Eddie, and my go-to the running girl. She has like an ongoing story throughout the game if you talk to her. It's really cool. Another new brilliant addition to the game in my opinion is the LGC alignment system. Even if it crops up only a couple times during the main story of the game, in Trails fashion, it's introduced as a way to work with certain factions at specific points in the game, and this opens up a bunch of playable characters for sections of the game. And it's a pretty great system overall. I kinda don't have many complaints with it. Some of the choices for the alignment system are dark or evil enough to make me not want to pick them at all. You also actually get some really cool rewards for leveling each one up to level 3, so if you go to play the game, I actually recommend at least getting each one to level 3 before min-maxing a specific one. There are some small, and I mean kind of really small, gripes here, like how there should probably be a law, grey, and chaos option for every quest that has an option to pick from, so the guessing game of, oh, is this a law, grey, or chaos option, could end. Or you could just put a simple labeling of the options to tell you which stat will increase from that choice for players wanting to min-max a certain alignment. This also fixes another very slight issue, which I actually think is kind of neat, but I get it, it's not exactly user-friendly, which is the fact that some of the choices fall outside what the starting quest menu tells you will increase. At the start of a quest, you have a quest accept screen, and on this screen you will see the alignment chart with a plus in certain attributes. But sometimes, a quest will tell you it increases law and grey, and it will actually have a chaos option, and stuff like that. I think this is Falcom telling you at the start of the quest which alignments get the +1 boost at the completion of the quest instead of what options you will have if there are any, but it isn't exactly well communicated. However cool it is that you have options outside of the initial boost Daybreak says that you'll get, because you know, the world isn't black and white, stuff can fall outside of expectations, etc, etc. But it's something that I feel like you probably need to either make more obvious or change just a tiny bit to account for this. I hope the alignment system continues to be improved over the Calvard arc with more rewards and places during the plot where it checks your rank for a situation, because it's such a cool system, especially for a world as dense as Trails with its world building, characters, and story. Which is a segue, by the way. Hello! The LGC isn't the only part of the side quests that makes them shine though. There's also the fun recurring characters that have multiple quests throughout the game and some world building done through them. For example, you do a quest for Jess, a musician in the city, early on about finding a notebook, and then later on you can find Jess just diegetically playing music in the concert hall in Riverside. And I can't stress to you, this is like some of the coolest, this is like one of the coolest discoveries I've ever had playing a game. This is so cool. Another subtle world building thing like that is that during chapter 3 of the main story, you basically attend the Oscars, and the film that won the Lion d'Or, which is definitely not a riff on football's Ballon d'Or at all in the slightest, is won by a film called Wolves Requiem. The next time you're back in Edith, you can actually watch Wolves Requiem in the cinema, but only at night, because the cast mentions in some optional dialogue running around town how it's getting a re-release to commemorate winning the Lion d'Or, but only doing night showings because it's a half a year old. That is some next level commitment to your world building. Maybe it's some of the best I've ever seen, and this series alone fills that top 10 of that. Like, I can't believe how good that is. Speaking of other side story stuff, the side story social links you can do in Daybreak are also really, really good. There are a couple in particular that are really heartwarming, like Agnes's and Nina's, and others that do actually have some pretty decent reveals and scenes inside of them for side characters, but actually also some pretty important characters too. Some of them are filled with references to previous Trails games and name drops, which are always fun as a Trails lorehead like myself. And to talk about the main story a little bit, it stands near the top of the series' best, thanks to its character writing, pacing, and masterful plot structure. Trails Through Daybreak is a game that gets better the longer you play it, and that's pretty rare, especially for a 70-hour long RPG. And that isn't a case of, oh, it gets good 20 hours in. No, it starts at a 10 and somehow ramps up from there to be even better in every chapter that follows. Playing Tales Through Daybreak, it's almost like building a wall, where each chapter adds another layer of bricks to the foundation, expecting you to take in and remember the last layer of story, while adding more to it each chapter. There are some reveals that have small one-line references in an early chapter for foreshadowing, to only be pseudo-revealed in the mid-game with a blink and you miss it line, and expecting you to pick up on that by the time the game makes it obvious. That's a real example too, not the Elaine part. We used Elaine for this because we love Elaine in this house, but in general, Van actually, in particular, reacts in a way that implies he seemingly already knew the answer, even if it was only subtly revealed to the player if they paid close attention to specific scenes and continued intrigue throughout the game. And that this scene in the final chapters is actually the first time they just look directly at the camera and tell it to you outright. It feels like a way to reward the player for paying attention to the details of this series that is filled with incredibly deep and dense details. This also goes for where Daybreak sits in the timeline of the series too, with it actually incorporating elements of previous games into the main plot, and Van being a character that literally just knows everyone in the Trails universe. This makes the game, and even Van himself as a character, feel like a reward for playing the rest. So while you could start here, as much as you can start at any of the first games in each arc, sorry fellas, I took 250 screenshots in Daybreak, and most of them were references and callbacks to prior games, which is way more than any other game in the series. So Sky is still, and always will be, the best entry point, followed by Cold Steel, and then probably Daybreak. Realistically, you'd get by finding Daybreak, but Trails to me is a series all about the plot and world building that gets added to with each subsequent game, so for me, I'd only ever start at the start. Anyway, mini ramble aside, back to the story. I won't get too deep into spoilers here, even though I probably have already said a few small ones already, but there are scenes in this game that are just some of my favourite in the entire series, man. The first one that comes to mind is Ren's scene with Van early on, that's essentially just a Trails in the Sky fan service scene featuring Kilika and Jin, which really got to me emotionally thanks to the conversation Ren and Van have. But really, if I'm being honest with you, the main scenes I want to talk about are basically any scene that has Van and Elaine on screen together. When it comes to characters in Trails Through Daybreak, there's no shortage of absolutely amazing characters to pick from. You have new characters like Agnes, Judith, Shizuna, Aaron, Katra, Nina, and then you also have some returning characters who are also fantastic, like Ren and Jin. But Van and Elaine are the standout characters for me in a game filled with standout characters, and their relationship is something special the series hasn't really seen before. We've had similar pairings like Estelle and Joshua, who go way back and are always the highlight of any scene they're in thanks to their chemistry, but Van and Elaine just hit different, man. It's definitely partly because of the mystery and the backstory between them that will assumedly be something that's built on for the trilogy of Calvard games, and how the relationship and their journey together is a bit of a slow burn, which makes you relish any scrap of content. But there's something to this relationship which is built upon Van's seemingly sudden disappearance and not leaving a trace, or even talking to his best friends Elaine and Renee about it, and the rebuilding of that bridge that Van broke many years ago between him and Elaine that's just inherently interesting to me as a player. Not only that, but it helps that Van and Elaine are characters I can relate to at a wholly personal level. I mentioned it in the Reverie video about the Daydream focusing on Elaine and how that hit home for me. Well, Daybreak subtly and slowly builds upon that as Elaine's character develops throughout the game, and I just love her so much, she's so good. Van, on the other hand, is a character I can relate to because he loves food and cars as much as I do, and he swears a lot, which is something I also tend to do when I'm not writing a script. His personality's fun too, especially the part about him being in denial about being old, as I, myself, am also a quarter of a century old, and saying that makes my joints creak. And the fact Van knows everybody and everything that has happened in the Trails universe feels like a way to reward players for having played the games prior to this one, and it really, really lends. By the end of the game, Van is probably my favourite protagonist in Trails not named Estelle, and that's a high bar to hit, given the quality of Trails protagonists generally. Any scene Elaine and Van have together, alone, would be one of the best scenes in the game. This includes even the social link scenes, which were at least heartwarming, if not downright amazing. The first one is just a simple scene about Elaine being interviewed in a place Van so happens to be at, and after seeing Elaine clearly not loving that she's being interviewed, he orders her a drink unbeknownst to her, which doesn't solve things between them immediately, obviously, but it's just one of those things you can't help but watch and think it's one of the most wholesome and heartwarming things. I'd love to talk about the scenes from later in the game in regards to these two, but if you've not played the game, then I don't want to say anything that's too spoilery. But I love Van and Elaine, and they're pretty high up on the list of my favourite characters from the series only after one game, and honestly, even after one game, I'm pretty comfortable saying that both of them are pretty high up on my favourite characters in anything full stop. Trails Through Daybreak is at its best, well, all of the time, pretty much. There isn't really a section of the game that drags too much, and every new section is somehow better than the last. It's an experience that I feel will only get better with time, as the more I sit on it, the more of my issues fade away and the list of things I love grows. I've been watching the game after completing it, and picking up on details that I missed, or remembering certain bonding events that pay off later on in the story, and even just remembering the vibes of certain sections, it's just making me love the game even more with every minute I watch. Daybreak is not only zenith fiction to myself on a personal level, it's also something I can wholly say is pretty close to being a masterpiece. There's a few blemishes in the transition between combat systems, but most of them are just fixed in the upcoming sequel anyway. Trails Through Daybreak is also a marker for me personally. It's actually the first game that has lived up to my lofty expectations of it in years, which is not much of a personal marker, of course, but I've been burnt on every game that I've been extremely excited about since 2020 in some capacity. Whether that's just myself being way too excited and expecting it to change my life, which isn't how you should go into games generally, or that's because the game just didn't turn out to be that great. It's something that has really plagued me for years at this point, with so many of my most anticipated games just falling short for me. Daybreak was a game I was excited about for 3 whole years. Hell, I even started learning a new language partially because of my anticipation for this game, and planned to play it in Japanese more than a year ago at this point before realizing my Japanese skills were way below the level needed for that. It's probably been one of my most anticipated games ever, and for it to stick the landing the way it did, and not only stick that landing, but run with it to exceed my expectations in so many different departments, makes me truly happy. From gameplay to the story, visuals, and even all the way down to the ambient dialogue, goddammit, Trails Through Daybreak is an amazing video game that I highly recommend. It's a masterpiece on almost every front, and is the beginning of what could be one of the best trilogies in gaming if the pace keeps up. So, thanks Valcom for rewarding my dumb overblown excitement for things with a game that is an eternal favourite of mine, and renewing my want to be excited about video game releases again. And thanks to you, the viewer, for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video that ballooned into something way longer than I thought it would end up being. So subscribe if you like this stuff. There's gonna be more game stuff in the future. There is more game stuff on the channel, actually. If you like this, there's other videos that you can watch. Made a good Persona one a few months ago. There's a Trails one from last year. There's some good stuff here. But I gotta go be excited about Daybreak 2, because Elaine's in that game, and she's in the party, I think, as far as I can tell. So, goodbye. I'll be seeing you around. I gotta get excited for more Elaine content. Goodbye.